The blizzard had no mercy. It tore across the frozen wasteland like the wrath of forgotten gods, burying everything beneath layers of white death. Nina stumbled forward, her legs barely holding her weight anymore. Each step felt like walking through water, thick and impossible. Her arms clutched the small bundle against her chest. The only thing that mattered in this dying world, inside the tattered cloth, Torrin barely moved. Her son, her precious child, felt lighter than he should. His breathing came in shallow gasps that terrified her more than the storm itself. She pressed her lips to his cold forehead, whispering words she wasn't sure he could hear anymore. "Little star, Mama won't let you go." But even as she spoke, she knew the truth. The cold was winning. Her bare feet had stopped bleeding into the snow because the blood itself had frozen. Her body shook so violently she could barely keep Torrin secure. The exile from her tribe 3 days ago had been a death sentence disguised as mercy. They had taken everything except her child and the clothes on her back. "You are useless to us," the tribal elder had said, his silver eyes cold as the ice around them. "You cannot hunt. You cannot fight. You only consume resources we cannot spare. Leave before we make you." She had fallen to her knees and pleaded for Torrin's sake, if not her own. But her people's faces had been carved from stone. Even her own mother had turned away. Now, in this endless white nothing, Nina understood that her pride had killed them. She should have begged harder, should have offered herself as a servant, anything to keep Torrin alive. Instead, she had walked away with what little dignity remained. And now that dignity would be their grave. Her knees hit the snow. She hadn't meant to fall, but her body no longer obeyed her will. The wind screamed around her, and she curled herself around Torrin, trying to be his shield one last time. Her eyes grew heavy. The cold didn't hurt anymore. That was how it happened, she'd heard. First the pain, then the numbness, then the sleep that never ended. "I'm sorry," she whispered against Torrin's hair. "I'm so sorry I couldn't save you." Darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. She let it come. Maybe death would be warmer than this, but death didn't come. Instead, something else did. She felt herself being lifted, though her body was too numb to fully register it. A voice spoke, deep and foreign, words she didn't understand. Strong arms held her and Torrin both, carrying them as if they weighed nothing. She tried to open her eyes, tried to see, but the effort was too much. Warmth. That was the next thing she knew. Gradual, painful warmth that made her nerves scream back to life. She gasped, her eyes flying open, and found herself staring at rough stone walls. A cave. Firelight danced across the ceiling. And beside her, wrapped in a blanket far thicker than anything her tribe had owned, Torrin lay breathing, steady, alive. Nina's hands flew to him, checking, feeling. His skin was still cold but warming. His chest rose and fell with more strength than before. A sob tore from her throat, relief so powerful it hurt. "Easy." The voice made her freeze. She turned her head slowly, and her breath caught. A human sat across the fire from her. She had seen humans before, from a distance. Her people traded with them occasionally, wary exchanges where both sides kept weapons close. Humans were dangerous. Everyone knew that. They were unpredictable, violent, too emotional, and too strong. This one was no exception to the physical description. He was large, broader than any male of her species. With skin darker than the cave walls and eyes the color of tree bark in spring, scars crossed his face and hands, telling stories of violence she couldn't read. His hair was black and short, practical rather than decorative. He wore thick furs and leather clothing meant for survival in the harshest conditions, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Nina's instinct was to run, to grab Torrin and flee, but her body wouldn't move, and even if it could, where would she go? Back into the storm? The human had saved them. He could have left them to die, but instead he had brought them here, built a fire, wrapped them in warmth. The human slowly reached beside him and picked up something. Nina tensed, but he only held out a piece of dried meat. Offering it to her without speaking, her stomach twisted with hunger so fierce it made her dizzy. But fear held her frozen. What if it was poisoned? What if this was some human trick? But then Torrens stirred against her, making a weak sound, and she remembered that she wasn't alone in this. Her child needed her to be brave. With shaking hands, she reached out and took the food. The human nodded once, then returned his attention to the fire, giving her space. Nina tore a small piece and chewed it carefully, waiting for some terrible effect. When nothing happened except the blessed relief of food in her empty stomach, she took another piece and softened it with her own saliva before pressing it to Torrens' lips. Her son's mouth opened instinctively, and he swallowed. Then again, a tiny sound escaped him, almost like contentment. And Nina felt tears burn down her frozen cheeks. The human glanced at them, and for just a moment, something softened in his expression. Not pity, not exactly. Something else. Something that made Nina's heart beat differently. "Thank you," she whispered in her own language. Knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he might understand the meaning, the human's lips quirked slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. He spoke then, his voice low and rumbling. "Marcus." Psst. He pointed to himself. Marcus' understanding dawned. Name. He was telling her his name. Nina touched her own chest with one trembling hand. Nina. Then she carefully touched Torrens' small head. Torren. Marcus nodded, repeating the names carefully, his accent strange but his effort clear. Nina Torren. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the fire. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside this small cave, something else was beginning. Something fragile and unexpected. Nina pulled Torren closer, settling against the cave wall. Her eyes kept drifting to Marcus, studying him. He had built this fire, gathered this wood, shared his food. He had saved her life and her son's life without asking for anything in return. Her people had cast her out to die, but this stranger, this human, had chosen differently. The firelight caught the scars on Marcus's hands as he fed another branch into the flames. Those were fighters' hands, survivors' hands. But they had been gentle when they carried her, careful when they wrapped Torren in the blanket. Nina didn't understand it, didn't understand him. But as her exhausted body finally began to relax, as the warmth seeped into her bones and her son's breathing grew stronger, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. She watched Marcus settle against the opposite wall, his eyes closing but never fully, always alert for danger, even in rest. A protector. A warrior. And inexplicably, impossibly, he had chosen to be those things for her. Nina's hand found Torren's tiny fingers, holding them gently. "We're going to live, little star," she whispered, "because of him." The fire crackled between them, and outside, the storm continued its rage. But inside, two souls from different worlds had found each other in the darkness, and neither of them knew yet how much that meeting would change everything. The storm's fury lasted 3 more days. During that time, the cave became its own world, separate from the frozen wasteland beyond. Nina watched the entrance constantly, half expecting the blizzard to breach their shelter, but Marcus had chosen well. The cave ran deep enough to protect them, and he had stacked stones and packed snow at the mouth to create a barrier that kept the worst of the wind out while letting smoke from the fire escape. Nina's strength returned slowly. On the 2nd day, she could sit up without her vision swimming. By the 3rd, she could stand and walk to the cave entrance, though her legs trembled with the effort. Torren improved faster, the resilience of childhood bringing color back to his cheeks and strength to his small limbs. He even smiled once, a tiny expression that made Nina's heart ache with relief. Marcus moved through their small space with quiet efficiency. He melted snow for water, cooked small portions of preserved meat over the fire, and kept watch through the long hours. Nina noticed he never truly slept, only dozed in brief intervals, always waking at the slightest sound. She wondered what kind of life taught a person to sleep like that. On the 4th morning, she woke to find him gone. Panic seized her immediately. She clutched Torren and stared at the cave entrance, her mind racing through terrible possibilities. Had he abandoned them? Had something taken him? How would she and Torin survive alone? But within an hour, Marcus returned, his shoulders dusted with fresh snow. He carried several dead creatures, small furred things she recognized as snow hares. He also brought an armful of wood, somehow dry despite the weather. Nina watched him prepare the meat with practiced hands, her panic fading into something more complicated. He hadn't left them. He had been hunting, providing. "Marcus," she said softly, and he looked up. She touched her chest, then gestured to him and the food, trying to convey gratitude with her hands since words failed them. He seemed to understand. His expression gentled, and he shook his head slightly, as if to say it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. That evening, after they'd eaten, and Torin had fallen asleep between them, Nina found herself studying Marcus across the fire. He was cleaning his hunting knife, the blade catching the light as he worked. The scars on his face seemed deeper in the firelight, shadows pooling in the old wounds. She wanted to know his story, wanted to understand who he was and why he had saved them. The language barrier felt like a wall between them, frustrating and thick. Marcus must have felt her gaze because he looked up. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a spark of connection that made Nina's breath catch. He was handsome, she realized, not in the way of her people, with their sharp features and silver eyes, but in a different way. Strong, solid, real. She looked away quickly, heat rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. The next day, they began teaching each other words. It started simply. Marcus pointed at the fire and said, "Fire." Nina repeated it, then gave him her word, "Flame breath." They continued like that, pointing at objects, at actions, building a bridge between their languages one word at a time. "Snow," Marcus said. Gesturing outside, "Cold rain," Nina replied. "Child," he said, nodding toward Torin. "Little life," she offered. Marcus smiled at that. Really smiled, and Nina felt something flutter in her chest. His whole face changed when he smiled, the hardness falling away to reveal someone younger. Someone who had once known joy before life had carved it out of him. As the day wore on, their lessons grew more complex. They used gestures and expressions, sometimes acting out meanings that made them both laugh. Torin watched from his blanket nest, his wide eyes following the adults with innocent curiosity. That evening, Nina gathered her courage. She pointed at Marcus, then traced a line down her own face, where his largest scar ran. She asked in his language, the words still clumsy on her tongue. Marcus's expression darkened. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he began to speak, his words slow so she might understand some of them. He pointed to himself, then held up fingers. A family, wife, daughter. Nina's heart clenched as she understood. He drew a line across his throat. "Gone, dead. Raiders," he said, and even without knowing the word, she heard the pain in it. "I was away, trading when I returned." He made a gesture of burning, of destruction. Nothing left. Tears filled Nina's eyes. She reached across the fire without thinking and touched his hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered in her own language. "I'm so sorry." Marcus looked at her hand on his, and slowly, carefully, he turned his palm up and closed his fingers around hers. His hand was rough and warm, completely engulfing her smaller one. They sat like that for a long moment, two people who had lost everything, finding comfort in shared grief. "Why did you save us?" Nina asked softly, not expecting him to understand, but Marcus seemed to grasp the question. He looked at Torin, then back at her. "Because I couldn't save mine," he said simply. "But I could save you." Nina understood enough to feel the weight of those words. This man had lost his family and had been wandering this frozen wasteland ever since, carrying his grief like a second skin. And when he'd found her and Torin dying in the snow, he had been given a chance to rewrite his own story. Even if he couldn't change the ending, she squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back. Over the following days, something shifted between them. The lessons continued, but now they were punctuated with longer conversations, even when neither fully understood the other. They learned each other's gestures, the meanings behind expressions, subtle languages that existed beyond words. Nina told him about her tribe, about the exile. Marcus's jaw tightened with anger when he understood what had been done to her. She explained that her people valued strength above all, and she had been born weak, unable to hunt or fight. When Torrens' father had died in a hunting accident before the child was born, she had become a burden no one wanted. Marcus shook his head firmly. "Not weak," he said, pointing at her. "Strong. Very strong." He gestured at Torren at the journey she had made. "Most would die. You lived." For him, his words struck something deep inside her. No one had ever called her strong before. In her tribe, she had been the weakest, the most useless. But Marcus saw something different. He saw a mother who had carried her child through a blizzard, who had kept walking even when every part of her screamed to stop, who had chosen to face death rather than abandon her son. Maybe he was right. Maybe there were different kinds of strength. One evening, as Nina nursed Torren, she found Marcus watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she caught his gaze, he didn't look away. "Beautiful," he said softly. Nina's breath caught. She knew that word. They had learned it days ago. "What?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus gestured to her and Torren together. "Beautiful. Mother and child. Beautiful." Heat flooded Nina's face. Among her people, she had been considered plain, unremarkable. But the way Marcus looked at her now, with warmth and something deeper in his eyes, made her feel seen in a way she never had before. "You are kind," she replied in his language. The words still awkward but sincere. Marcus shook his head. "Not kind, just see you. Really see you." She realized that was exactly what he did. He didn't see her as weak or useless or a burden. He saw her as she was, a person, a mother, someone worthy of care and protection, someone worthy of being saved. Nina found herself drawn to him in ways that both frightened and thrilled her. She noticed things she shouldn't notice, like the way his muscles moved when he worked, the deepness of his voice when he spoke, the gentleness of his hands, despite their obvious strength. She found excuses to sit closer to him, to touch his arm when making a point, to hold his gaze a moment longer than necessary, and Marcus noticed too. She saw it in the way his eyes tracked her movements, in the small smile that played at his lips when she laughed, in the careful way he made sure she had the warmest spot by the fire. On the 10th day in the cave, the storm finally broke. Weak sunlight filtered through the clouds, turning the world outside into a glittering expanse of white. Marcus ventured out to scout, and when he returned, his expression was serious. "Must leave soon," he told her, using the simple words they shared. "My home, settlement, 3 days' walk. You and Torren come." Nina's heart raced. Leave the cave? Go to a human settlement? The idea terrified her. But the alternative was worse. She couldn't survive alone in this wilderness with a child. And more than that, she didn't want to leave Marcus. The thought of parting from him created an ache in her chest she didn't want to examine too closely. "Yes," she said firmly. "We come." Marcus's shoulders relaxed with visible relief. He nodded, then surprised her by reaching out and cupping her face gently with one calloused hand. "Good," he murmured. "I want you safe. Both safe." Nina leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. His hand was warm against her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin with heartbreaking tenderness. When she opened her eyes, she found him closer, his face just inches from hers. She could feel his breath, warm and steady. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility. Nina's heart hammered in her chest. She had never felt this before, this pull toward another person, this desperate want mixed with tender affection. Torren chose that moment to wake with a cry, and they sprang apart. But as Nina tended to her son, she felt Marcus's eyes on her, and when she glanced up, the heat in his gaze made her skin tingle. They spent the next day preparing for the journey. Marcus fashioned a carrier for Torren that would keep him warm and secure against Nina's chest. He packed supplies carefully, rationing what they had for the trip ahead. He even made Nina a pair of rough boots from spare leather and fur, wrapping them around her feet with gentle efficiency. "Can't have you walking barefoot," he said. his fingers lingering on her ankle just a moment longer than necessary. That night, their last in the cave, Nina couldn't sleep. She lay awake, watching the fire burn down to embers, listening to Marcus's breathing across the space. Tomorrow, they would leave this shelter, this small world where it had just been the three of them. She didn't know what waited at the human settlement. She didn't know if she would be welcome, if she and Torin would be safe. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She trusted Marcus. More than that, she was falling for him. This fierce, scarred human who had pulled her from death and shown her that she was worth saving. He had given her more than her own people ever had, and in return, she was giving him something she thought she'd never give anyone again. Her heart. Marcus. She whispered into the darkness, "Yes." His voice came back immediately, alert. "Thank you for everything." A silence. Then, "Sleep, Nina. Tomorrow we walk." But she heard the smile in his voice, and it warmed her more than any fire could. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, they prepared to leave. Marcus extinguished the fire and packed the last of their supplies. Nina secured Torin in his carrier, the child gurgling happily against her chest. She took one last look at the cave that had sheltered them. That had been the place where everything had changed. Marcus appeared beside her, offering his hand. "Ready." Nina looked at his outstretched hand, then at his face. She saw concern there, and determination, and something else that made her pulse quicken. She placed her hand in his. "Ready," she said, together with Torin between them. They stepped out into the bright snow and began their journey toward whatever future awaited them, and for the first time since her exile, Nina wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to hope,